Welcome to the second video for chapter 12. So I had just finished talking about the 4 stages of cognitive development according to the theory from Piaget. Before we move on, I do want to point out that, as your textbook says, there have been several critiques or criticisms of that original theory. But it certainly was kind of the starting point for the field in terms of how to talk about cognitive development, and it still is kind of the groundwork of how people do their research. But as the textbook points out, there are several flaws to it. One of which being, that Piaget probably kind of overplayed how egocentric kids are. His theory didn't really account for cultural influences, viewed cognitive development as kind of 4 distinct stages rather than kind of this overlapping process. So there certainly were flaws, and so I want to acknowledge those as well. But let's shift gears now to talk about moral development. And so this might seem like a little bit of a weird transition, but the reason we talk about this next is Kohlberg was very heavily influenced by Piaget and then developed his own theory, which was 3 stages of moral development. And so his theory states that young children make moral decisions based on kind of this fear of punishment. Basically, they make the decision because they don't want to get in trouble. It isn't necessarily that they understand right or wrong or they want to do the right thing. It's more of a they don't want to get in trouble, which then kind of develops into this idea of they make decisions based on what's in their best interest, which might be more complicated than trying to avoid punishment. But especially for young children, that's kind of the main reason that they make their decisions. Around age 10, it starts to get more complicated because social relationships start to become more important, and so we start to develop loyalty to other people, and so we might start to make our moral judgments based on what we see other people doing, or because we want to support people we care about. Then a little bit later in adolescence, it starts to shift more to we understand what the rules and the laws are, and so that's why we make the decisions we make. Not everyone achieves this last level that he referred to, which is essentially we make moral judgments based on universal human rights. And so an example that's often given is Martin Luther King Jr. And so, not all adults reach that stage. Some people kind of hang around this level of moral development, which is more of they make decisions based on what they know the law says or what the rules are. And so the theory that we got from Kohlberg is a little bit old school. It's a little bit outdated because it really doesn't account for example, why someone might lie. And so the more current way that we talk about moral development is actually in the context of emotion regulation and how our ability to cope with emotional reactions impacts our decision making in different situations. I also want to kind of pause and talk a little bit about parenting because the moral development research grew into us questioning what we can do to then inform parents on supporting their kids in making better decisions. And so a lot of research has come out of understanding the type of parenting that would be considered more supportive and more efficient in helping a child in terms of emotion regulation. And so, one thing that research has shown is that physical punishment is not very effective, that things like spanking or hitting your child has more negative consequences than positive consequences in terms of long-term development. Things like power assertion where, the parent tries to dominate a child is also not very effective. Instead, you're actually better off reinforcing when the child makes good decisions. So, if you see a child share a toy, say, that was very nice, or I liked how you shared that toy, or, can't you see that made Sally happy when you shared the toy with her? So kind of reinforcing and pointing out the good things that the child does. And if you do see problematic behavior, actually talking to the child about it and helping them better understand how their behavior impacts others rather than simply punishing. So the moral development research has really, I would say, kind of changed shape to talking more about emotion regulation, which then has informed how we help parents become more effective parents. All right, so let's shift gears now and talk about gender development. And before we get too far, I want to point out that I liked a lot of what your textbook did, but also saw some of their content a little bit problematic. So, for example, they define gender identity as a child's sense of being male or female. And I acknowledge and will point out that they did later say that that definition has flaws because, for example, an individual might identify as non-binary, which means they don't identify as male or female, or they might identify as both. And so the problem with that definition is that it really does kind of adhere to and reinforce this idea that one is male or female, that there's no room between the two categories. And so although the book pointed out that their definition had some issues, they still used that definition. And that's what frustrated me a little bit. And so I've adjusted it a little bit to make it what I think is a more inclusive definition, which is a child's sense of maleness or femaleness, which to me, just the minor changes in phrasing really helps us understand that gender identity is essentially how we feel within ourselves in terms of our own gender. And so an individual might identify as male, they might identify as female, they might identify as neither, they might identify as both. And so we really, as a field of psychology, I would say we have learned a lot, especially in the last like 5 or 10 years, in terms of the spectrum of genders and how the child's gender identity develops, and even how gender might evolve later in life. And so I really do want you to kind of think through how your own gender developed and your own gender identity maybe evolved when you were a child. And most people that are cisgender, which means that they identify with their biological sex from birth, most cisgender people don't even pause to think about this. They just say things like, well, I've always known I was, a girl or a woman, or, what do you mean? When did I realize I was a girl? And they seem kind of off put by the question. But that's how gender identity is for all people. So people that identify as transgender, for example, that's kind of the same process they went through, that they always felt like the gender that they identify with. And so this really is just kind of a subconscious process that just kind of happens behind the scenes where a child develops their sense of self. But there's this kind of parallel process going on called gender typing, which involves us socializing children into what we perceive as their gender role. So what happens is at birth, a child is born, and the attending doctor will examine the child physically, and based on the visible physical signs of sex, assign a sex at birth. And then the parents and really everybody around the child begins a process. It's not a conscious process. It just naturally happens, where they reinforce the child engaging in gender appropriate behaviors and punish the child when they engage in gender inappropriate behaviors. So we see this all the time where, a little girl is born, and the parents will decorate the kid's room in pink everything and put them in cute dresses and put bows on their hair, or in their head if they have no hair. When they're born, they get their ears pierced. And so the people around the child engage in this process where they're essentially socializing the child to engage in particular gender roles based on their sex assigned at birth. And so this can be highly problematic because the only person that can truly determine a child's gender identity is that child. And so sometimes children, do not feel like the gender that they're, the sex that they're assigned at birth. And so it can be very distressing for a child to get negative feedback that they're engaging in problematic behavior or dressing in problematic ways based on how they feel internally. So a lot of things impact how we develop and how our gender develops, biological, so things like prenatal hormones, cognitive. So for example, I think I said a second ago, but in case I didn't, around the age of 4 or 5, children have a very strong sense of their own gender identity. And for many people, that then stays stable. So for a little child to be adamant that they identify in a different way than their biological sex, in the past, a lot of really horrible decisions have been made on their behalf where, they might be forced to live as a gender they don't identify with, which then leads to increased risk of suicide, depression, substance abuse later in life. And then the last one is learning, which relates to gender typing. So we get a lot of reinforcement and punishment based on the behaviors we engage in. Essentially, are we conforming to the gender roles and gender behaviors that we should be based on our perceived gender? So there really has been a ton of growth in the field of psychology in terms of how we understand gender. And I just really want to kind of encourage people to have a greater appreciation for the diversity we have within our communities in terms of how people identify their gender, and be mindful of using people's preferred pronouns, or their pronouns, I should say, and just really understanding that our own gender development is the same process that other people go through, even if we may not necessarily have the same experiences in terms of socialization. That gender development really is this kind of universal process that, regardless of how you identify, we ultimately end in the same place of we feel confident in who we are gender wise, and we just need to respect that in everyone around us.